Okay,
All right.
Jeff.
Yep. All right. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for coming. So today's speaker is Zixi who is a postdoc in camera and a member of the Math for Experimental Data Analysis group at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. He received his PhD in mathematics from UC Berkeley in 2021. And so today, Zixi will talk about the mathematics of advanced correlation data analysis, how to extract complex dynamics from next generation correlation spectroscopy experiments. Go ahead, Zixi.
Oh, thanks, Jeff. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So today I'm going to talk about the mathematics of advanced correlation analysis and how such analysis can help us extract complex dynamics from next-generation correlation spectroscopy experiments. In particular, I will go into details of MTEX 3D, an algorithm we developed for extracting rotational diffusion from cross-correlation analysis. I will also discuss about some related works. So nowadays, correlation analysis has been applied in areas of many experimental techniques. These techniques take advantage of the unique properties of correlation analysis, allowing us to gain information into systems that may otherwise be challenging to study using the collected images alone. So the first example is fluctuation X-ray scattering. So this is a powerful technique for structure determination. Briefly, it is a solution scattering in which X-ray snapshots are taken in a timescale below the relaxation time of rotational diffusion. This can be achieved either by slowing down dynamics or by shortening the exposure time. By doing so, we can preserve the angular fluctuation of images, allowing us to calculate the angular correlation of the images. Then we can use the MTIP algorithm to efficiently reconstruct this structure. This framework was introduced in a previous camera talk. Researchers also perform correlation analysis for fluorescence correlation spectroscopy. This technique is widely used for biosamples to investigate dynamics of the particles of fluorescently labeled molecules. It can provide us information about diffusion processes, molecule concentrations, interaction kinetics, and so on by calculating the temporal correlation of the images. In neutron scattering experiments, people also perform correlation data analysis. In the experiments, scientists direct a beam of neutrons to the sample and then collect the scattering pattern and sometimes the energy change in the neutrons. Correlation analysis is performed in this context, for example, in quasi-elastic neutron scattering or in inelastic neutron scattering. We also have the X-ray photon correlation spectroscopy. This is an emerging technique for studying samples in nanoscale. It has found applications in many research fields like biophysics, material science, nanotechnology, soft matters. We will get to the details of this technique later. So usually we calculate the temporal autocorrelation, allowing us to study a wide range of dynamics. But similarly to fluctuation X-ray scattering, we can also manage to preserve the angular fluctuation of images. This would allow us to calculate what we call angular temporal cross-correlation. This will be on the topic of the talk today. So correlation data analysis is a powerful tool in the study of complicated dynamic systems. So now let me delve into XPCS specifically. X-ray photon correlation spectroscopy, abbreviated XPCS. This technique uses coherent X-ray beams to illuminate the samples to measure the dynamics of various kinds of samples. Fully coherent X-ray beams can enhance its sensitivity to sample structure and sample dynamics, enabling XPCS to probe a broad range of length scale and time scale. Here is an illustration of the experiments. In the experiment, the sample is illuminated by the beams, and then a time series, a sequence of X-ray scattering images are collected at ideally equally spaced time points. Here I show the collected images as a movie. These images are essentially intensity of the field, scattered by the particles within the illuminated area. The inhomogeneity of the electron density within the sample will lead to the variation of brightness across the collected images. Such a phenomenon is called speckle pattern. As we observe the sample at different time, the movement of the particles will incur the variation of the electron density, and so the temporal fluctuation of the speckle patterns. So inversely, by analyzing the temporal fluctuation of the speckle patterns, we may be able to recover the information about the dynamics within the sample. Based on these features, XPCS is well suited for studying disordered systems. And when it is being applied to the disordered systems consist of many disordered scatterers like this, the speckle pattern shows this classic noise-like grainy texture. With my eyeballs, it's really hard to tell any useful information about the dynamics out of these subtle fluctuations. However, general information about the dynamics is hidden in these subtle fluctuations. So to analyze the images, usually temporal correlation are calculated from these recorded images. For more complex dynamics, more complicated correlation analysis may be needed. To kick off the presentation, let me first give you a brief introduction to our works on correlation analysis for XPCS. The first is an algorithm for extraction of rotation diffusion. We call this algorithm multi-tiered estimation for correlation spectroscopy, in short, MTEX. We will get to the mathematical details of this algorithm later. So by utilizing information in the angular temporal fluctuation of XPCS images, this algorithm is able to estimate the rotation diffusion coefficients with relative errors of only a few percent. And it is the first algorithm to achieve this with no assumptions of specific particle shape. Well, there are some previous algorithms, but they all require a specific shape of the particles, like they ask the particles to be a cylinder or ellipsoid. The ability of some methods we developed for this algorithm is actually twofold. So relying on the underlying mathematical model, these methods can also be applied to filter the noisy input data so as to boost the signal-to-noise ratio. And as these techniques leverages the underlying compact representation of the data, it can also be used to reduce the larger amount of data into a more compact, more manageable form. Other than these, we also designed a phonon pair counting algorithm for handling time peaks detector data. So in order to achieve nanosecond or sub-nanosecond timescale, ALS beam scientists deploy time peaks detector data for software XPCS. One major property of such detector is that instead of conventional intensity curve we used to work with, these detectors record and output the phonon arrival time data. So this property is one of the keys to achieve smaller timescales. However, different data format causes some difficulty here. We cannot apply algorithm design for intensity curve directly to the arrival time data. So jointly work with Suzhou and his team, we designed an algorithm to process the time peaks detector data. And additional methods has been included to correct the bias resulted from the data sparsity. Here's an outline of the rest part of the talk. I will start with an introduction to the correlations, why we want correlation analysis. Then I will get to the background and X-ray phonon correlation spectroscopy. I will also sketch an overview of our results of our works, and then get to the mathematical details of the multi-tiered estimation for correlation spectroscopy algorithm. Then I will talk a bit about the future directions, the future works we were interested in. So first, let me give an introduction to correlation. Here's an example. Suppose we have two data arrays. They can be data we collected from the experiments. For example, they can be intensity recorded at two different pixels on the detectors. The top array is from one pixel and the bottom array is from another one. Or one of them could be a control parameter we input into the system, such as energy level or something related to the environment like temperature. Now, let's say we want to study the relationship between these two arrays. One way to do this is that we can pair the elements in these two arrays one by one and then perform the element-wise multiplication. This will get us this set of numbers. By averaging them, we get the first of what we call correlation data. Then we can shift one of the array to the right side by one element, let's say the bottom array. Then we can perform the element-wise multiplication over the overlapped part again to get another set of number, and then their average to give us the second correlation data. By repeating this process, we can get a new data array, which is the correlation data array of the two original data array. On the right side, you will see two functions, one in blue and one in orange. And here's a red dot representing the value of the correlation associated with the current shift between these two functions, which is 0 at this moment. So we can shift the function in orange to the right side by a specific amount, and the red dot is shifted along with that, representing the current correlation value. And then we can keep repeating this. But actually, for continuous functions and continuous signals, we can shift the function to the right side continuously to have the red dot plot a continuous correlation curve. So this move intuitively tells us how we calculate the correlation between continuous functions or continuous signals. Essentially, the correlation measures the relationship between data. It helps us understand the relationship between, it helps us understand how these two data arrays are related, whether they vary together or if one remains constant as another one changes. Correlation analysis also provides information about dependence and patterns between data sequences. By looking into the correlation, we can get valuable insight into the system that's generating these data arrays. Compared to original data, correlation offers us versatile ways to investigate systems, to investigate the relationship between different systems and different variables. So one thing that is worthy of mentioning is that in these two examples, we use these two different data arrays or two different functions. In this case, we call it cross-correlation, which means we correlate between different data arrays. Other than cross-correlation, we can actually calculate the correlation of a data sequence with itself. In this case, we call it autocorrelation. Through autocorrelation, instead of a relationship between two different data arrays, we want to know how parts of the data affects another parts of the data. Now, let's suppose this is temporal data. One number is collected earlier than another one. Then the autocorrelation, or more precisely in this case, the temporal autocorrelation can tell us how events happening earlier in the system affects the events happening later in the system. We will revisit autocorrelation and cross-correlation later. So the next question is, what can we get out of correlation? Why correlation data analysis is useful? Why don't we just work with the raw data? What can it provide us? Here I show some examples. So when we're interested in the static structure of a particle, we can perform spatial correlation, which means we correlate data collected from different spatial points. By looking into this type of correlation, we can get information about the structure. We can tell, for example, if the particle is somehow symmetric. At the left side, it is an example of a scattering pattern collected from a colloidal glass sample. And well, with my eyeballs, I can not tell any clear structure directly by looking into this image. But we can calculate the angular autocorrelation through this ring, and this will give us the curve at the right side. So this angular correlation curve indicates that the particle may possess a five-fold symmetric. Here, in fact, the correlation data exposes the similar patterns between different symmetric parts of the particles. And here is another example. This is a part of simulated curve collected from simulated experiments related to movement of many particles. Well, I can hardly tell any useful information about dynamics from these disordered curves. But its temporal correlation at the right side shows a clear pattern. It decays exponentially. In case this is the very typical result when we use correlation analysis of XPCS data to study translation diffusion. By fitting the autocorrelation to the exponential decay curve is typically how we estimate the translation diffusion coefficients. So usually when looking into some disordered systems generated disordered data like this, the correlation data analysis can help us expose some statistical property of the system. Other than that, the correlation data analysis can also help us study the collective properties of the systems. For example, the polydispersity or size distribution of the sample. Or it can tell us whether the system is going through some phase transitions. So in general, the method of correlation data analysis can be particularly useful when studying systems where the relationship between the variables is not immediately apparent, or the relationship is subject to change. This technique allows us to quantify and identify those relationships, even when they may be subtle or non-stationary, enabling us to delve deeper into the relationship between datasets between different quantity of interest. So now let me get into a bit more about mathematics of traditional analysis of X-ray photon correlation spectroscopy data analysis. A widely used way to analyze XPCS data is to calculate autocorrelation. Here, recall that autocorrelation refers to correlation between identical data sequences, which means we correlate the sequence of data to itself. So on the right side, I show an illustration of autocorrelation. J are the images on which the polar coordinates is used to indicate spatial positions. Let's say Q is the radial coordinates and phi is the angular coordinates. The way we calculate autocorrelation from XPCS images is we first pick a pixel from the detectors. We pick a spatial position. Then we gather data collected from this pixel from all the different images associated with different time. Then form a data array. Then we can calculate the autocorrelation of that data array. In the context of XPCS, we usually calculate this normalized autocorrelation G2. Here's the equation. T is the lag time here, and the bracket indicates ensemble average. In thermal equilibrium systems, the ensemble average is equivalent to the temporal average. So when calculating this G2 function, the average is taken over the stubby variable tau here. Regarding to the angular coordinate phi, you will find that this angular coordinate phi is omitted here in many literatures. That is because one can show that for disordered systems with no preferred orientation, the fit doesn't matter. So usually we perform the angular average over these rings to achieve better data quality, and this step get rid of the angular coordinates fit. So the reason why this is called G2 is that it corresponds with the second order degree of coherence of the light. And there's also something called G1, which is associated with the first order degree of coherence, which is the autocorrelation of the scattered field. Such a quantity cannot be directly assessed from X-ray scattering experiments. At the bottom right, I show some examples of the normalized autocorrelation G2 calculated from simulated experiments. For diffusion of non-interacting spherical particles, the G2 function shows the classic exponential decay pattern. We can see the pattern of exponential decay to 1 here. Well, for those of you that may have experiences with XPCS data analysis, this doesn't look like the usual plot because I didn't use the log scale on the left time here. So after the G2 function is calculated, we can fit a parametrized model to the obtained data to optimize for the desired parameters. Let's say we want to find the parameter data here. Then we can fit this parametrized model to the obtained autocorrelation data. The choice of this parametrized model depends on the samples or the dynamics we're studying. And our prior knowledge can be formulated as this penalty term, or can be formulated as the constraints over the parameter data. For translation diffusion, this model will just be a simple exponential decay. But if we want to study more complex dynamics, more sophisticated models may be needed. Here I present several examples of the results that we can obtain by applying the correlation analysis on the XPCS data. The first one is to estimate the translation diffusion coefficient. As I mentioned in the previous slides, for the monodispersed, non-interacting spherical particles, the autocorrelation curve of the XPCS images would decay exponentially. In fact, one can show the G2 should be in this form. G2 equals to 1 plus beta times this exponent. Beta here is the spectral contrast, and dt is the translation diffusion coefficient. So by fitting this model to the obtained autocorrelation G2, we can estimate the translation diffusion coefficient. Another example is slightly more complicated. In this example, correlation analysis was applied to study the surface dynamics of chains in polymer mixtures. This model is actually a mixture of two exponential decaying curves. So by fitting this model to the obtained autocorrelation, the authors of this paper found the existence of two relaxation time. One is 2 orders of magnitude smaller than another one, hinting the dynamics of two populations of chains. There's also other correlation analysis other than autocorrelation. For example, the 2-time correlation that can be used for studying the non-equilibrium of dynamics. In thermal equilibrium, the ensemble average is equivalent to time average, but when the dynamics is not in the thermal equilibrium, this is not the case anymore. So researchers propose to use this 2-time correlation to study the non-equilibrium dynamics. So this 2-time correlation has 2 temporal variables, and it can give us when fixing Q, it can give us a 2-dimensional plot rather than a 1-dimensional curve. We can see from this plot, we can see the increase of correlation time from this 2-time correlation. Like that is because actually the alloy sample in these experiments became more ordered. The last example is for the measurement of small deformation for measuring of the string of materials. This technique actually requires only 2 diffraction patterns. By using this locally averaged spatial correlation analysis, features in the starting diffraction pattern can be matched or can be related to the deformed diffraction pattern. This will allow us to measure the shift in the wave vectors so as to obtain the string matrix. More details about this work can be found from the cited references I put here. But other than these wonderful works, potentially there are much more we can do with correlation analysis, especially after the light source upgrades. For example, the correlation data of XPCS can help us extract the rotational dynamics, in particular, the rotation diffusion dynamics. So the rotation diffusion refers to the phenomenon that non-interacting particles in the fluid media change their orientation randomly from time to time. The movie at the right side intuitively illustrates this process. Knowledge about this process provides us information about the size and shape of the particles. We can tell about viscosity of fluid or how the particle interact with the surroundings, etc. So understanding about these dynamic processes is crucial for understanding molecule collisions, protein functions, biomolecular reactions, and other processes. We will come to this more details later. Correlation analysis can also help us filter noise to get cleaner data. For example, it can help us with the background noise or noise resulted from the detector malfunction. Of course, like there's no data analysis technique can help with the severe detector malfunction like power outage or detector destroyed. Here, I mean those more milder ones, like pixel saturation, leaking intensity, misdetection of photon events, or detector background. Correlation analysis can also help us with dynamical scattering artifacts. Potentially, we can also obtain better, more accurate size distribution by using more advanced correlation analysis. This is one next step we are very interested in. We may also be able to reconstruct magnetic and charge order through correlation. So to sum up, there's huge potential with correlation analysis. It is a very useful technique for investigating both the structured information and dynamic information. However, it is very likely asked that if we want to study more complicated systems, more subtle structures, more complicated dynamics, the relationship between the variables may become less obvious. In such case, we need more sophisticated tools, more sophisticated computation methods to process and analyze the correlation data. So this is where mathematics can come into play to help us to review those hidden information in the correlation data. Here, let me show you briefly our results of an algorithm, MTech3D, to extract the rotation diffusion. So the process of rotation diffusion is characterized by the rotation diffusion coefficients. Roughly speaking, the rotation diffusion coefficients quantifies how far away a particle can spin within a unit of time, within the time interval. It's a bit like the standard deviation of the Gaussian distribution that describes how spread the distribution is, how wide the peak is. So this coefficient can provide plenty information about properties of the particles. So leveraging on a advanced correlation analysis, namely the angular temporal cross correlation, we designed our algorithm MTech3D to estimate this coefficient. So the detail of the angular temporal cross correlation will be talked in the next section. We tested the performance of this algorithm on generated dataset we obtained from an XPCS simulation framework. In this image at the bottom left, we show the results from two simulated systems, in which different structures are simulated and different ground truths of the rotation diffusion coefficients are selected. The ground truth is represented by the cross, and the estimated values are represented by the red square. We can see the red squares almost overlaps with the ground truth. And this inset in the plot shows the level of the relative variables between the estimated value at ground truth. All the relative variables are at the level of only a few percent. Here I put a flowchart at the bottom right to give a sketch about how this algorithm works. The whole algorithm includes many mathematical projectors and mathematical components. Taking the angular temporal cross correlation data as an input, we apply these projectors, these operators, iteratively to filter the input data and refine our estimate of the desired coefficient dr. Due to this iterative filtering of the input data, this algorithm is robust against noise. We will also get into the details of this algorithm in the next section. Another example of our work is with time peaks detector. So unlike traditional detectors, the time peaks detector output arrival time of each photon instead of average intensity. Here's a visualization of the sparse photon arrival data within the shutter, and each of the peaks represents a photon arrival event. So this detector would allow us to delve into dynamics with an unprecedented timescale, making it possible to capture and analyze dynamics that cannot be monitored before. To effectively process the arrival time data, we developed a new algorithm based on the photon pair counting methodology. So when dealing with a traditional intensity curve, if we want to calculate the correlation data, we can simply integrate or sum through the intensity curve. But for arrival time data, we cannot do this directly. So of course, we can cut the time interval into smaller bins to turn the arrival time data into intensity curve we used to work with. But doing this leads to either loss of time resolution if the bin is too huge, or large memory and computation cost when the bin is too tiny. So instead, we count directly the number of photon pairs with specific lag time. As we can see from the visualization, the data could be really sparse. So we also integrate a supplementary approach to correct the bias and noise that dominates when the data is very sparse. For example, when calculating the denominator of the G2 function, there's a bias term resulted from the Poisson statistics of the particles, of the photons. So if the data is not sparse, then this term becomes negligible. But when the data is super sparse like this, we cannot ignore the term anymore. So additional statistical methods should be included to address this issue. In summary, altogether, the combination of these advanced correlation analysis and our innovative algorithm opens the door for investigation of dynamics with unprecedented timescale. Other than these works, we also have two ongoing projects. One is to extract the fully anisotropic rotation diffusion tensor of the three-dimensional anisotropic rotation diffusion. So let's imagine a particle, let's say, for example, a long thin rod. It is naturally that this long thin rod will spin way faster with respect to one or two its axis rather than the others. So to characterize this anisotropic dynamic process, a 3x3 rotation diffusion tensor instead of a rotation diffusion scalar is needed. Valuable information about the directional properties of particles can be obtained by measuring this tensor. I will discuss about how we plan to extend the methodology of MTEX to this case. Another one also involves correlation analysis. The traditional theory of small angle X-ray scattering and fluctuation X-ray scattering assumes a uniform orientation distribution of the particles within the sample. However, this assumption is not always valid. Sometimes the orientation distribution is not uniform. So when this assumption is not valid, it will introduce bias into the model. So on the one hand, taking this extra factor into consideration can help us correct the bias in the model. On the other hand, if we can somehow manipulate non-uniform orientation, we can get extra information that is not accessible from conventional SAX or FXS experiments. With this help, the correlation analysis in conjunction with advanced algorithm is capable of achieving more accurate reconstruction. So right now, let me use the multi-tiered estimation for correlation spectroscopy algorithm as an example to show you how we design a correlation analysis to expose the desired information and how to extract the desired coefficients through a carefully designed mathematical algorithms. Here's a movie to illustrate the rotation diffusion process. In a dilute fluid media where the particle of interest does not interact with each other, those particles would receive successive collisions from many nearby solvent particles. Given that there are so many such collisions from different particles from different directions in a very short amount of time, the overall effect of all of these collisions in a slightly larger timescale will look like random, as these collisions may be from like different directions or they may act different forces on the particles. So the particle seems to move randomly from time to time. We call this random positioning translation diffusion. If a particle is non-spherical, we would also see them change their orientation randomly from time to time. We call this random reorientation rotational diffusion. Here I present the mathematical description for translation diffusion that R denotes the location of a particle. So the mean square displacement of the location can be modeled by this. It is proportional to the size of the time interval t times 2 times the translation diffusion coefficient dt. As for the rotation diffusion, the description is more complicated because the orientation is distributed over the SO3 rotation group. So let omega be the orientation and p be the probability distribution of the distribution. Then p should satisfy this partial differential equation. In this equation, dr is the rotation diffusion coefficient, and m is a set of quantum mechanical angular momentum operator in the units of h bar. Knowledge of these coefficients, both the translation and the rotational, provides us insight into the mass distribution and size, and they are significant to understanding of the dynamic properties of the particles. So far, as I introduced before, dt can be well estimated from fitting the autocorrelation G2 data of the XPCS to the exponential decay curve. But there was no algorithm for estimating dr of three-dimensional rotation diffusion from XPCS data without requiring a specific shape of the particles. So all the previous algorithms for this task, in the context of XPCS or in the context of the predecessor of XPCS, the dynamic light scattering DLS, require strong assumption of the shape of the particles. Usually the shape, they assume the particles should be a cylinder or ellipsoid. By doing this, a simplified model of the rotation diffusion and a simplified model of the resulting experimental data can be derived in order to seek the coefficient. But our goal here is to estimate the rotation diffusion coefficient of the particles with arbitrary shape. Of course, we have to assume the particles is non-spherical. Otherwise, there's no way we can see their rotation from scattering patterns. To estimate the rotation diffusion coefficient dr, the autocorrelation G2 cannot provide us sufficient information. This detailed explanation can be found from our previous paper about MTEX of two-dimensional case. So to address this issue, we propose using the angular temporal cross correlation. which is the natural generalization of the autocorrelation. Here's the formulation. At the top right, I show an illustration of the cross-correlation. The cross-correlation, which means we can correlate 2 points at different spatial positions, whereas the autocorrelation correlates points at the same spatial positions. Now, suppose we correlate 2 points at Q, phi, Q prime, phi plus delta phi. Delta phi is the angular difference here. Then we can calculate the temporal correlation between the intensity data we collected from these 2 pixels. And then we perform the angular average over these 2 rings. Doing this, we get the angular temporal cross correlation. In the special case where we have Q equals Q prime, delta phi equals to 0, this can be reduced to the denominator of the autocorrelation G2. As these 4 arguments varies, Q, Q prime, delta phi, delta t, the cross correlation can generate as a 4-way data tensor, whereas the autocorrelation can only give us a data matrix. So in the experiments, let's say with hundreds of radius coordinates and hundreds or thousands of angular coordinates, the cross correlation can produce millions more numbers than autocorrelation. And this difference becomes even more tremendous when working with the megapixel detectors. Another advantage of cross correlation has is that it uncovers information in angular fluctuation. So if we can preserve the angular fluctuation of the images, this angular cross correlation can pick it up, and autocorrelation cannot. By doing this, it can expose the rotational dynamics. The angular fluctuation of the images is the very key information we need to estimate the rotation diffusion coefficients. We will see this at the next page. So intuitively, it can measure the pair of photons that are scattered along different wave vectors. And these photons may be related or correlated by the rotational dynamics of the particles. This information is key to extract the rotational dynamics, and in the case here, key to the estimation of the coefficients. So here I show a piece of the correlation data. Here Q, Q prime, delta t are fixed. I plot this correlation curve against the angular difference delta phi. For this piece, it has a W-like shape and with a lot of noise. The next question is, given this cross-correlation function, how do we relate it to the rotation diffusion coefficient dr? How do we interpret this high-dimensional angular temporal cross-correlation data? Well, assuming a dilute monodispersed sample where the particle of interest have rho as its scattering density. So basically means let rho be the electron density of a single particle. Then we can prove this following conclusion. In the limit of infinite number of images, the cross correlation can be expanded into this series. The left side of this equation is the angular temporal cross correlation minus the product of these 2 terms, which are the angular temporal average of images at different radii Q prime. We can prove that this term is actually the angular average of this correlation with respect to delta phi. At the right side, NP is the number of the particles in the illuminated area. As we are correlating different spatial positions, contribution from different particles decorrelates. We see only the terms from each of the individual particles. So the right side is proportional to NP. Within the summation, we have these. This is the value of the associated Lagrange polynomials, and these are terms related to the electron density. In fact, ILM is the spherical harmonic coefficients of the intensity function IQ, which is the squared modulus of the Fourier transform of the scattering density rho. Then this part is the exponential decay rates resulted from the rotation diffusion, and this is the desired rotation diffusion coefficients. So to estimate dr from this angular temporal cross-correlation data, we leverage this mathematical model, this series expansion, to design an algorithm called multi-tiered estimation for correlation spectroscopy in 3D. Before I introduce the algorithm, I make a flowchart to summarize the mathematical model introduced in the previous page. So starting from the electron density, we can perform the Fourier transform to get the form factor, which can be viewed as the field scattered by a single particle. Then, by taking its squared modulus, we get an intensity function, and by spherical harmonic transform, we get the intensity spherical harmonic coefficients. On the other hand, given the rotation diffusion coefficient, we can calculate the exponential decay rates explicitly. Multiplying these 2 parts together, we get Lagrange expansion coefficients. And through the inverse Lagrange expansions, we get the angular temporal cross correlation. So the question is, given this data, given the angular temporal cross correlation data, how does MTech 3D invert this forward model to get the rotation diffusion coefficients? Well, instead of solving the complicated direct optimization, MTech decomposes its problems into the subparts. We don't expect to estimate dr in just one step. We don't expect to jump from here all the way down to here. We seek to find all the intermediate parameters step by step and progress to our goal. Each of the subparts can be efficiently tackled with a carefully designed projector. By applying the correlation noise projector, we can update our guess of the Lagrange expansion coefficients, and then by applying the band limiting projector, we can get a Fourier Basel expansion. I will explain this later, from the Lagrange expansion coefficients. And then by performing the exponential fitting tensor factorization, we can separate the Fourier Basel coefficients A from the decay rates, which we will estimate the rotation diffusion coefficient. However, there's one problem. Each one of the projector individually enforces only one constraint derived from the mathematical model. But all the intermediate parameters should satisfy those constraints at the same time. So to refine the results, we apply these operators in an iterative form, in an iteration manner, to enforce these constraints altogether. So these projectors in an iteration would produce a consistent solution that maps the input cross-correlation data to the form that complies with the underlying mathematical model. Then how exactly do the projectors tackle those subparts? So the first one is correlation noise projector. In matrix notation, the cross-correlation data, denoted by C here, can be represented as a matrix multiplication as P times B. P is the matrix of the values of the associated Lagrange polynomials, and B is the Lagrange expansion coefficients. So this can be viewed as solving a overdetermined linear system, but instead of playing least square, we solve it as follows. Given an initial guess, the correlation noise projector seeks to find a minimum perturbation through this Tikhonov realization to have the updated value lies within the estimated uncertainty of the data. Then we can apply the band limiting projector to denoise to obtain the Lagrange expansion coefficients. Here we actually need an upper bound of the diameter of a single particle. Then based on the Fourier Basel series of the Patterson function, we can derive band limiting basis expansion basis and let V be the band limiting basis functions. In matrix notation, this can be written as B equals to the product of V times G, the matrix of the Fourier Basel expansion, and then times V conjugate transpose. We can invert this pseudolly by multiplying the pseudo-inverse of V at the left side and right side of B. Then G is actually a tangle of the Fourier Basel coefficients of A and the exponential decay rates E. So here we can separate these two parts from G by realizing that G is a outer product of A, conjugate A, and the decay weights. So by gathering the G matrices from different time slices from different lag time, we can turn G into a tensor with decomposed factor matrices A, conjugate A, and E. So therefore, we can formulate this partial Hermitian tensor factorization to separate A and E, and then extract dr directly, as E is a matrix value function depending on dr. Then starting from the current estimate of dr and E, we can calculate the updated values of the intermediate parameters. Following the forward model, from A and dr, we can get new Fourier Basel expansion, G, and then from G, we can get B, which can serve as the initial guess to the next iteration. So putting all the math components together, gathering all the mathematical representations of the intermediate parameters, I make this flowchart. One thing worth of mentioning is that the loop terminates when the difference between the estimates of B is small enough, although dr is eventually what we desire. Putting the stopping criterion on B makes the overall loops more robust. And here I'd like to emphasize several properties of MTech3D algorithm here. First, it estimates the rotation diffusion coefficient iteratively as the loop goes. Through this iteration, we will gradually get better estimation of the desired coefficients. Second, the algorithm filters the input data to enhance robustness against noisy input data. So when refining the estimate of rotation diffusion coefficients, MTechs can also improve the estimate of these Lagrange expansion coefficients. We can actually use the loss of the estimate of B to obtain a cleaner angular temporal cross-correlation data that agrees with the underlying mathematical model. So we say by doing that, the algorithm filters the input data to obtain the cleaner data. Third, MTechs requires almost no prior knowledge. Neither the projector nor the forward model needs the particles to be in a specific shape. The only prior knowledge needed is a rough estimate of the diameter of the particles. This information is required by the band limiting projector. Such an estimate doesn't have to be very precise. Of course, a value close to the actual value would improve the performance of the band limiting projector, but it'll be fine as long as this estimate is larger than the actual value. In fact, a relative loose number, for example, in the order of 10% larger than the actual value should be sufficient. So in practice, it should be easy to obtain such a number. Fourth, though almost no prior knowledge is required, when such information is available, MTechs can still utilize them. For example, if we know the particle is some sort of foldable symmetric, then some terms in the Lagrange expansion will vanish, and this information can be hard-coded into implementation accordingly. Here I show the results of the numerical experiments. To test our algorithm, we used an XPCS simulation framework to simulate two particle systems. One contains the particles consists of crossing nanorods. So this system is more similar to the material science application scenario. In another system, we simulated particles using the PDB-1 IGT structure. This represents the biological samples. The figures at the top left show some example images. At the left side, I show some ideal clean images. So from these ideal clean images, we add pulsar noise on top of that to get the simulated noisy images. And these simulated noisy images are the testing data set to our algorithm. So by adding noise, we end up getting the noisy images with signal-to-noise ratio around 0.9. And the sparsity of the images collected from the crossing nanorods system is about 4%. And as for the PDB-1 IGT structure, the sparsity is about 10%. For each of the systems, we generated several data sets, each with different ground truths of the rotation diffusion coefficients. The magnitude of the ground truth values are chosen based on the size of the particle simulated and scaled by the Stokes-Einstein relation. And for different particle systems, the exposure rate are simulated differently. Of course, like in order to monitor faster dynamics, in order to see dynamics in a much smaller time scale, we should record images in a higher rate to prevent the time difference between consecutive measurement to exceeding the relaxation time. Now, one thing is, in these systems, in each one of the testing data sets, it contains like 32,000 of images. In these two tables, I compare the estimate values with the ground truths. The relative errors between them are also shown in this table. We can see the relative errors are at most 3%. Other than estimating the rotation diffusion coefficient, MTech3D is also capable of filtering the input data. Here I show some examples in the figure at the bottom left. So the C and dots are the noisy input data. The filter data output by MTech's algorithm is the black solid line, and the ground truth is represented by the red dashed line. We can see the filter that even though the input data is quite noisy, the filter data output by the MTechs largely overlaps with the ground truth. Actually, on our test, the signal-to-noise ratio of this data is in general boosted by 4 or 5 orders of magnitude. So a paper describing this algorithm and presenting this result is in the review process right now. We expect it to be published soon. So more details can be found from that paper. After introducing the MTech3D algorithm, now I want to talk about one of our immediate next steps to extend the approach of MTech to extract the anisotropic rotation diffusion tensor. Here I show a movie of three-dimensional rotation diffusion at the right side. We can see when the particles change their position randomly, they also rotate randomly. But in some cases, the anisotropic structure of the particle or some other causes will lead to what we call the anisotropic rotation diffusion, in which the rates of the rotation with respect to different axes is different. Whereas in the isotropic case, the rates with respect to all the axes are the same. To characterize such process instead of a rotation diffusion coefficient, we need a 3x3 tensor, the rotation diffusion tensor. Using the principal axis of inertia, the tensor can be diagonalized into this form with diagonal entries d1, d2, and d3. They characterize the rotation with respect to different axes respectively. So well, in the last section, we talked about the MTech3D algorithm. Though that algorithm is designed for isotropic case, the algorithm can still be applied to the anisotropic case we're talking about right now, and it is able to give an estimate of the average of the d1, d2, and d3. However, in order to get more detailed directional information, we need to estimate each individual values of d1, d2, and d3. This requires us to extend the MTech3D. So the partial differential equation describing this rotation diffusion was derived by Favreau in 1960. Here's the capital omega is still the orientation, and p is the distribution over the rotation group SO3. And m is still the set of quantum mechanical angular momentum operator, satisfying the usual angular momentum commutation relations. Given the partial differential equation here, we can establish the following model, like in the isotropic case, to relate the angular temporal cross-correlation to the rotation diffusion tensor here. Here, the left side remains the same as the isotropic case. Majority of the right side is still the same. The associated Lagrange polynomials and the ILM, the spherical harmonics of the intensity functions. but the decay rates are very different. It becomes a mixture of many exponents. A tau and E tau are the eigenvectors and eigenvalues of the matrix representation of this operator in this partial differential equation. A tau m is an entry of the A tau. So both of the A tau and E tau depending on the rotation diffusion tensor. For the sake of convenience, I copied the formulation of isotropic case here. By comparing them, we see both of the equations share common structure, the latest structure. PL, which is the associated Lagrange polynomials, and ILM are spherical harmonics. These parts are the same. So the methodology of MTEX can be well adapted to tackle these isotropic case and isotropic case. We can also try to decompose overall optimization into a series of subparts. In fact, the technique we developed for the correlation noise projector and the band limiting projector can be reused here. However, the 3D case is definitely more complex than the isotropic case. As the tensor factorization parts become significantly more challenging here. For example, in the tensor factorization of isotropic case, the matrix of the decay rates E is of 1 rank. Our formulation of the isotropic case utilizes this information to simplify the tensor factorization step. However, in anisotropic case, we need to deal with more complicated formulation. And in fact, on the other hand, in the isotropic case, the dependence of the decay rates on the rotation diffusion coefficient can be represented in the closed form as e to the power of negative L times L plus 1 times T times dr. But in anisotropic case, this is not the case anymore. There's no closed form representation to represent how A and E depending on the rotation diffusion tensor as they involve the eigen decomposition. This is another difficulty we need to deal with. So finally, I will talk about the other future directions, the other future works we are interested in. The first one is to develop better methods for determining size distribution. So for this talk, there are some existing methods. However, many of them need a strict assumption on the model. For poorly dispersed samples, the XPCS autocorrelation curve would be a weighted summation of exponents if we assume the particles to be spherical. Then by fitting this mixture of exponential decay curve to obtain autocorrelation, we can get a distribution of different translation diffusion rates. Then using the Stokes-Einstein relation, we can get a distribution of the size. There are also some other methods requiring the assumptions like the prior assumptions about distributions. However, when such assumptions are not valid, the results would be biased. One way to obtain a better method is to design a specific physical descriptor based on the band limiting structure introduced in the MTEX 3D algorithm. And another way to do that is to adapt our MTEX 3D algorithm to poorly dispersed samples. So instead of a single scalar, potentially we can use the philosophy of MTEX 3D to extract a distribution of the rotation diffusion coefficient rates. The second work we're interested in is to incorporate data reduction techniques with correlation analysis. So the advancements in detectors and beams would bring in orders of magnitude increase of the data volumes collected. In my numerical test to MTEX 3D, each of the test datasets contains only 32,000 images. This is not a huge amount. I can store them in one piece and analyze and process them later. But actually, in fact, my own code of finding angular temporal cross correlation takes only a few minutes using 64 computing nodes on the nurse promoter machine. But this plain method is not able to keep up with the data generation rate the light source is going to provide us. So dedicated data transfer infrastructure, specialized computing resources, and tailored data reduction algorithms are all in needs. On the other hand, the correlation data analysis should also be designed to take consideration the quantified uncertainty and loss introduced by the data reduction technique. And also the data reduction technique should be designed in a way that it takes consideration of the downstream analysis purpose and the samples and dynamics we're about to study. Actually, I believe the MTEX algorithm is on this track. Well, so the MTEX philosophy, the MTEX algorithm includes a step to estimate the uncertainty in the data. And also, the iterative nature of MTEX made it possible to turn it into a streaming data manner, in which the algorithm iterates as newly collected data keeps coming in. So I'm interested to see if our algorithm can be extended to that application scenario. The third work I want to pursue is to apply the MTEX on experimental data. I'm looking for real data to test and refine the algorithm. Well, we should be able to release the code and package in very soon, so I'm just going through some paperwork here. I'm also seeking to extend the approach of MTEX to other experimental techniques, for example, like gradient incident XPCS, resonant XPCS, and neutron scattering experiments. At the end of this talk, I would like to thank the help of Jeffrey Dumsley, James Sethian, Mark Sutton, Alex Hexamer, Sujoy Roy, and Greg Stu for their help and enlightening conversation throughout the development. The work is also supported by the camera project funded by DOE ASCA and BES, and the DOE Base Mass under Office of Science. Thanks for your attention. I'm happy to take questions.
Jeff, do you want to handle this or you want me to?
Either way is fine.
So Zixi, I have one. What kind of data do you actually need for the 3D? I mean, are the light sources able to provide it now? And if anybody from the light sources can pipe up on this, that would be great.
I think the light source can provide it now. So ideally, I would want a dilute suspension, like the particle of interest is dilute in the solution, that they don't interact with each other. And I would like the particle to be, of course, I want the particle to be a bit like anisotropic in order to see their rotation.
Well, let me ask the light source people. Has anybody got any? Jeff, you have people with hands up, like Sujoy and Kanyapriya.
Let's see them. Oh. Okay, there it is.
I have a question, but I think Sujoy might want to elaborate on having data.
I don't know. You can go ahead, Kanupriya. That's fine.
Oh, you go ahead because you're collecting data on it.
Okay. Hey, Zixi, nice to see you. Very nice talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, in the simulation that you showed, so these are the noise that you say, is that like is that photon, or ultimately you're collecting them as a function? Or yeah, this is somewhere here. Is it like you ultimately making this into speckle, or you're still in the photon, like you're still, these dots are how you are working with?
So the left side would be clean speckle pattern without any noise. The left side, yeah, that show the grainy, shall I? Yeah. So these show the speckle patterns, the grainy texture, and then I just turn them into adding the Poisson counting noise on top of that. So many of them, because here I assume the magnitude of data is not huge. So many of them will just be rendered into 0. These are the remaining dots.
Oh, so on the left side, the speckle pattern, you add Poisson noise.
Yeah. Yeah, and then they become distorted because like many of the values are rendered to 0 because like the magnitude is so tiny.
And then you had in the in the loop you had this correlated noise or something like that word, right? What does that mean exactly in the terms of is that mean that somehow you're finding out that what are the correlated noise that you want to take away from the data? Or where is that noise? There is a term there that I found very interesting word.
You mean in the equation or in the flowchart?
No, I thought it's in one of the equation slides, something that it shows that you are taking care of the noise. Yeah, this is like this correlation noise projector. This is,
yeah.
How do we think? Is this like the noise? This is the noise, right? You're taking care of the noise.
So this C is the noise input, and this parameter tau is actually estimated from. So because the C should follow some like underlying mathematical model, we estimate the amount of noise in this data based on how the collected data agrees with the model. And so which means like we have a mechanism to estimate the amount of noise in the data. And then we do this fit according to like how much noise is in the data. Like if the data is real clean, then we fit to the data more. If the data is really noisy, then we allow the algorithm to probe a bit further away.
And finally, the last is that you know, the system, I think, has both a translation as well as rotation, right?
Yes.
So the net curve should have the two decays. There will be a translation decay and there should be a rotation decay. And there
So
should be a coupled thing too.
yeah, so this is the equation of the cross correlation. So like if we take Q equals to Q prime and delta phi, which means then we can turn this into the autocorrelation. So which means if you plot the cross correlation curve against the angular difference, then there will be a peak at angle equals to 0 and angle equals to pi. That represents the like translation decay, the translation decay resulting from translation diffusion coefficients. But in order to find the rotation diffusion coefficient, we used only parts between the peak, which means we exclude the part containing the translation diffusion to isolate the part containing the rotation diffusion.
But actually, in a real system, like Jamie was asking, in the data, you will have both, right? Because it's undergoing both. So actually, there will be a translation, there's a diffusion and rotation, and then there's a cross-coupling term.
Yes.
And this equation captures all of that?
Yeah, that's because like the parts related to the translation and also the coupling term is kind of like diminishing and negligible if we take the middle part of the curve. Those terms are represented at the two peak at the end at pi at the angle equals to 0 and pi. If we mask out those peaks, then the middle part will just be the main contribution to the middle part would be from the rotation diffusion.
Okay. All right. All right, good. Great work. Great work.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Oh, I just wanted one clarification. So in the current formulation, are we assuming a single species, i.e. just a single density, or can we handle more than one
Yeah, so
rows?
so here I assume there's one specific structure and one specific rotation diffusion coefficient. So we're trying to get that number. Like that's actually the next step we want to, let me find that page. Yeah, so this is one of the next step we want to get the size distribution. So that is one step we want to extend the current framework from monodisperse sample to polydisperse sample. By doing that, we should potentially get a distribution of different rotation diffusion rates. And right now, if we apply this algorithm directly to polydisperse sample, the result output by it would be a weighted average of all the rotation diffusion. It will get an average of them.
Right, thanks.
Do you think you're going to be able to get a distribution or simply an average over different types of particles?
So right now, the particle in its shape right now can only get one number, which means an average over the distribution. But
Yeah.
in the next step, I plan to extend these methods to polydisperse samples to try to get a distribution.
I don't quite see what in the formulation will allow you to extract a distribution. I must be missing something.
That's in the tensor factorization step. The correlation noise projector and the band limit projector will remain the same. In the tensor factorization, right now, in the formulation, let me find the formulation. So right now, this E matrix is actually, all of its columns are the same. So right now, I've used this fact to simplify the tensor factorization step. But when I assume there's a distribution, I can turn these like columns into all different modes and then get different exponential decaying rates.
Okay, this is a really geeky question. Never mind. Let's do this offline.
Any other questions for Zixi? Sophie?
Sorry, we cannot hear
You're
you.
muted, I think.
We heard something, but it was very quiet.
Is that better? Or
Yeah.
Now we can hear you. Yeah, thank you.
sorry. Thanks for the nice talk. I was just curious on the simulation side, how those simulations were done.
So I actually coded this simulation framework work by myself because I know the model describing the rotation diffusion and translation diffusion. So instead of using a MD simulation to simulate all the collisions, I just directly following the partial differential equation to calculate the orientation and position of those particles. So which means like I didn't simulation the collision, but those movements are simulated from the partial differential equation describing them.
So, if I had like helical, so we look a lot at helical materials and helical domains.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if it's generalizable to other systems or it has to be kind of particles in solution type
So my
things.
simulation can work with different structures, but because I'm simulating through the partial differential equation directly, so we need a clear formulation of the underlying dynamics. If we don't have that formulation, which means in the case we need to simulate the force and the collisions between them, then an MD simulation might be a better choice.
Okay. And then I would imagine that the APS might be the upgraded APS might be the place where you would get data that you can compare this to. I don't know. Is that the plan? Or because
Yeah.
you need a lot of coherence and you need,
Yes.
yeah, a lot of signal.
Yeah, like here right now I assume like how do you, yeah, better coherence would generate us better data, and the data would be more closely aligned with our model.
Yeah, it seems like you need the higher order intensity in the diffraction. So you need, yeah, a lot of coherence
Yes.
and a lot of intensity.
Yes, that would be great.
Thank you. That was very
Thank you.
interesting.
You have another question, Sujoy?
Yeah, I just wanted to, Sophie's question makes me ask you one more question. It's not a question, rather comment. You know, in your simulations, Zixi, it's particles in solution, right? So they are
Yeah.
physically like changing their coordinate positions in space, like a Brownian motion. But in a
Yeah.
solid, a lot of the time it's fixed lattices, but the, let's say, spin is fluctuating. Is there a way to model that? Have you thought about that? That how do we think about it? Because I'm kind of facing that problem a little bit, and I can touch base with you later on, as Jimmy was saying. These are into the weeds. But as a general thought, the difference between a colloid and solid is that colloids are like literal Brownian particle moving, but in a solid they are static, but somehow they're fluctuating in position and in one fixed position, but the vector is changing direction. I
Oh,
mean,
that's an interesting model. You mean like their spatial positions are fixed, but they keep changing orientation in that common
exactly.
spot.
Right. Exactly. That keep changing the orientation, but the spatial position is fixed. Exactly.
So if I imagine the collected images, it will be show a lot of like bright peaks when and but I believe there's some information between the bright peaks to show related to the rotation diffusion. So in order to do that, I have to, yeah, there will be extra terms in this equation. I think we should be able to find a way to handle that. Like, yeah, that's a really interesting model.
Okay.
Any last questions for Zixi? All right, I guess that brings us to the end. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you, Zixi, for the talk.
Thank you.
Have a nice day, everyone.
Thanks.